My name is Stephanie. 3 days after my mother's funeral, my older brother slid a folder across the dining room table and told me I had 14 days to leave the house where I had cared for her for 6 years. He said it gently, almost kindly. That was what frightened me most. Then he showed me a deed with my mother's signature on it. The signature looked real, the date did not. I was 34 when this happened, and for a long time I believed the worst part was being left out of my mother's will. I was wrong. The worst part was discovering how many people had quietly agreed that my pain was an acceptable price for keeping their lives comfortable. Before I tell you how the truth finally came out, subscribe to Unheard drama stories. Here, the people who were ignored get to finish their own sentences, and the truth is allowed to arrive without shouting. The daughter who stayed. My mother, Ellen, had always been the center of our family, though not in a dramatic way. She remembered birthdays, kept spare keys, mailed soup recipes, and somehow knew when one of us was pretending to be fine. When she was diagnosed with Parkinson's, my brothers, Mark and Caleb, held a family meeting at her kitchen table. Mark lived 40 minutes away. Caleb lived in another state. Both said they would do whatever it took. What it took, in practice, was me. I moved out of my apartment and into Mom's small blue house in Ohio. At first, she only needed help with medication and driving. Later came the falls, the night confusion, the shower chair, the endless insurance calls, and the mornings when her hands shook too badly to hold a spoon. I reduced my hours at the dental office, then left entirely when she could no longer be alone. Mark sent money twice. Caleb visited at Christmas and posted smiling photographs that made him look like a devoted son. Mom knew the imbalance. She would squeeze my wrist and whisper, "I see you, Steph." I told her that was enough. I truly believed it was. At the time, I kept trying to explain the situation in the kindest possible way. That was an old habit of mine. Soften the truth until everyone else felt comfortable, even when I was the one being hurt. Looking back, that instinct was not kindness. It was fear dressed up as patience. After that moment, even ordinary routines felt different. I wrote down dates, saved messages, and separated what I knew from what I feared. That discipline mattered because manipulation thrives when every conversation begins from zero. The part I had once described as being left out of my mother's will was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. I thought about the younger version of me who had learned that being loved meant being easy to manage. She would have apologized simply for making the room uncomfortable. That was when I stopped measuring my choices by whether the family approved and started measuring them by whether I could live safely with the result. The promise at the kitchen sink. About a year before she died, Mom stood beside the kitchen sink while I washed her hair in a plastic basin. She was embarrassed by how much help she needed. I tried to distract her by talking about repainting the porch. She said, "This house should be yours." I told her not to talk like that. She became unusually firm. She explained that the savings would be divided equally, but the house would come to me because I had given up income, retirement contributions, and 6 years of my own life. She had already spoken to an attorney named Ms. Alvarez. A month later, Mark began visiting more often. He brought groceries, fixed a gutter, and asked questions about Mom's paperwork. I was relieved. I thought guilt had finally turned into responsibility. Instead, he started telling Mom that keeping the house was financially dangerous. He said Medicaid could take it. He said taxes would destroy me. He said transferring it early would protect the family. Whenever I entered the room, the conversation stopped. What made it confusing was that nothing looked dramatic from the outside. There were no broken dishes, no screaming in the street, no scene that would make a stranger stop and stare. The damage happened in polite sentences, delayed replies, missing information, and decisions that had already been made before I was invited into the room. What happened next was not one dramatic explosion, but a series of smaller realizations. I noticed how often concern was expressed as pressure. Forgive quickly, decide privately, avoid embarrassment, and remember everything the other person had ever done for me. The part I had once described as being left out of my mother's will was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. The more calmly I responded, the more urgently others tried to provoke an emotional reaction. Anger would have allowed them to change the subject from what happened to how I behaved after learning it. The shift was small from the outside, but inside me, it changed the direction of the entire story. 14 days. Mom died on a cold Tuesday morning with my hand around hers. The funeral was full of people telling me how lucky she had been to have me. Mark cried into my shoulder. Caleb thanked me in front of everyone and promised we would take care of each other now. 3 days later, they returned with the folder. The deed said Mom had transferred the house to Mark 8 months earlier for $10. Mark explained that he was the legal owner and planned to sell. He said I could stay for 2 weeks while I figured things out. Caleb stared at the table and repeated that it was what Mom wanted. I checked the date. 8 months earlier, Mom had been hospitalized after a fall. She had been heavily medicated and confused for nearly a week. The notary stamp belonged to someone named Donna Pike. I had never heard the name. When I reminded Mark about Mom's promise, his face hardened. "You got free housing for 6 years," he said. "Don't act like you got nothing." That sentence ended something inside me. I wish I could say I recognized the pattern immediately. I did not. When you have loved people for years, your mind does strange work on their behalf. It searches for innocent explanations. It edits out the sharp edges. It calls betrayal a misunderstanding because a misunderstanding feels repairable. I kept returning to the same uncomfortable question. There was financial and practical damage, but there was also a quieter loss, the realization that someone had planned around my expected silence. The part I had once described as being left out of my mother's will was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. I wrote down dates, saved messages, and separated what I knew from what I feared. That discipline mattered because manipulation thrives when every conversation begins from zero. I could not control what anyone admitted. I could control whether confusion continued to make decisions for me. The camera Mark forgot. I did not argue. I asked for a copy and went upstairs. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone twice before calling Ms. Alvarez, the attorney Mom had mentioned. She told me not to move, not to sign anything, and not to alert my brothers that I was contesting the deed. The house had a small doorbell camera I installed after one of Mom's falls. I had paid for cloud storage and forgotten that recordings were saved for a year. On the date of the transfer, the camera showed Mark arriving with a woman carrying a notary bag. Mom was still in the hospital. They entered using his spare key and left 20 minutes later. There was no recording of Mom entering the house because she had not been there. I searched Mom's medical portal. The same afternoon the deed was supposedly signed at home, a nurse had documented that Mom was disoriented, unable to state the month, and awaiting a neurological consultation in room 414. For the first time since the funeral, I stopped crying. Grief was still there, but now it had structure. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying every small moment I had dismissed, the changed subject, the nervous glance, the joke that landed too close to the truth. Separately, each detail had seemed harmless. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer look away from. For a while, I believed the safest response was to keep everyone calm. Each time I tried to describe the problem, someone reduced it to a personality conflict. Facts were treated as anger, while the behavior that created them was treated as family business. The part I had once described as being left out of my mother's will was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. Each time I tried to describe the problem, someone reduced it to a personality conflict. Facts were treated as anger, while the behavior that created them was treated as family business. For the first time, I gave my own memory the same credibility I had always given everyone else's explanation. The voice memo. Ms. Alvarez found something else. Mom had come to her office 10 months before her death and signed a will leaving me the house. 2 months later, Mark called to cancel Mom's follow-up appointment, claiming she had changed her mind. Ms. Alvarez refused to discuss details with him because he was not her client. Then she asked whether Mom had used a smartphone. Mom recorded reminders because her hands made typing difficult. In her voice memo app, buried between grocery lists and medication notes, I found a recording titled House. Her voice was weak but clear. "If Mark says I gave him the house, I did not," she said. "He keeps bringing papers. I told him Stephanie gets the house. Stephanie stayed. Stephanie gave me my life at home." She paused for a long time, breathing heavily. "I am afraid he will make me sign when I am not right." I listened once. Then I placed the phone on the bed and walked into the bathroom because I thought I might be sick. Mom had known. She had been frightened in her own house, and I had mistaken Mark's new attention for love. There is a particular kind of loneliness in realizing that the people who know your softest places have been using that knowledge as a map. I did not feel angry first. I felt embarrassed. Then I remembered that trust is not stupidity. The shame belonged to the person who exploited it, not the person who offered it honestly. After that moment, even ordinary routines felt different. I thought about the younger version of me who had learned that being loved meant being easy to manage. She would have apologized simply for making the room uncomfortable. The part I had once described as being left out of my mother's will was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. I began to understand that the conflict was not only about the latest event. It was about a long arrangement in which other people made choices and expected me to absorb the consequences. The truth was still painful, but it was no longer shapeless. The family meeting they expected to win. Mark called another family meeting after receiving the attorney's notice. He arrived confident, with Caleb and 2 aunts behind him. He said I was prolonging grief and accusing him of a crime over a misunderstanding. One aunt asked why I needed an entire house when I was single. Caleb said court would destroy the family. I set copies of the hospital record, camera stills, Mom's will, and a transcript of the voice memo on the table. No one spoke for almost a minute. Mark finally claimed Mom had signed the deed in the hospital, and the location was a clerical error. Ms. Alvarez, who attended by video, explained that the notary's journal listed the blue house and that the notary was Mark's real estate client. She also explained that the $10 transfer had never been reported to Mom's attorney. I looked at Caleb and asked one question: "When did you know?" He began crying. Mark had told him about the plan 2 months earlier and promised him part of the sale. Caleb had said nothing because he had debts. For the first time, I stopped asking what would keep the family calm and started asking what would keep me safe. That single change in the question altered everything. It moved me from reacting to planning, from pleading to documenting, and from hoping someone would rescue me to understanding that I was allowed to protect myself. What happened next was not one dramatic explosion, but a series of smaller realizations. The temptation to act dramatically was strong. A public confrontation might have brought temporary relief, but it could also have scattered the evidence and allowed everyone to debate tone instead of conduct. The part I had once described as being left out of my mother's will was becoming something larger. A question of who was allowed to define reality when trust and evidence pointed in different directions. Nothing about the process felt powerful at first. It felt administrative, lonely, and slow. Only later did I recognize that consistency was becoming a form of strength. I did not feel fearless. I felt prepared, and preparation was enough to move forward. The case. The legal process took 9 months. It was not dramatic like television. It was forms, continuances, sworn statements, bank records, and long afternoons in beige rooms. The notary eventually admitted she had stamped the deed without seeing Mom sign it. Mark had brought a page that already contained a signature copied from an older document. The court voided the transfer. The prosecutor offered Mark a plea agreement related to forgery and attempted elder exploitation. He lost his real estate license. Caleb was not charged, but the money he had accepted from Mark became part of the record. My relatives divided into camps. Some apologized. Others said I had gone too far because Mark made one desperate mistake. I stopped explaining that a mistake is forgetting an appointment. A plan involving a forged deed, a compromised notary, and a grieving sister's eviction notice is not a mistake. The house returned to Mom's estate, and under her valid will, it became mine. I did not want revenge. Revenge would have kept me emotionally tied to them. What I wanted was a clean record of the truth, a boundary that could not be negotiated in private, and a future that did not depend on anyone suddenly developing a conscience. What I did with the house. For several months, I could not decide whether to stay. Every room held two memories, one tender, one painful. The hallway was where Mom practiced walking after physical therapy and where Mark had carried papers past the camera. The kitchen was where she promised me the house and where he later told me I had received enough. Eventually, I repainted the porch the soft gray Mom had chosen. I converted the spare bedroom into a small office and returned to work part-time. With a portion of the savings she left me, I created a local respite fund through a caregiver nonprofit. It pays for a few hours of professional support so family caregivers can sleep, attend appointments, or simply sit somewhere without listening for a fall. The fund is called Ellen's Room. I did not name it after myself because Mom was right. She saw me. What I needed afterward was to make sure other caregivers felt seen before grief and paperwork were the only witnesses left. People often imagine courage as a loud thing. Mine was quiet. It looked like saving screenshots, making copies, calling a professional, and refusing to answer messages designed to pull me back into panic. I was still afraid. I simply stopped letting fear make my decisions. What happened after? Mark wrote to me from a court-mandated financial ethics program. His letter was full of explanations about debt, pressure, and how certain he had been that I would be okay. He asked whether we could rebuild our relationship. I replied once. I told him I hoped he changed, but access to me was not part of his rehabilitation plan. Caleb and I speak occasionally. He has apologized without asking for forgiveness, which is the first honest thing he has done in years. I am not ready to call that a relationship, but I no longer need to call it nothing. The house is quiet now. Sometimes, while washing dishes, I still hear Mom's voice saying, "I see you, Steph." This time, I answer out loud, "I see me too." I had spent years believing that being the reasonable one meant absorbing more than everyone else. It does not. Reasonable people are still allowed to say no. The lesson I kept. Caregiving taught me how to keep someone alive. Betrayal taught me that I also had to protect the life I had left. Documents matter. Professional advice matters. But the first act of protection was believing that what happened to me was serious enough to name. I used to think good daughters kept families together. Now, I think good daughters tell the truth about what is pulling them apart. Some people will call your boundary cruel because your silence was convenient for them. Let them. A peaceful life built on truth may look smaller from the outside, but it feels infinitely larger when you are finally free inside it. Thank you for listening to my story. If you have ever been made to feel selfish for protecting yourself, remember this: love does not require you to disappear. Subscribe to Unheard Drama Stories for more stories where hidden truths finally have a voice.